The old snow lay in long white sheets across the bare shoulder of Bracken Ridge, broken only by two sets of hoofprints already filling with wind. A young woman in a borrowed wool coat stood alone at the edge of a steep pitch, a small bundle at her feet and a tin locket cold against her throat. Below her, two riders grew smaller down the switchbacks, never once turning back to see whether she still stood. Her breath came in, slow counted fours, as the light began draining from a sky gone the color of skimmed milk. She did not scream after the men, and she did not sit down in the snow, because sitting down was the one thing the mountain wanted from her. Instead, she turned her back on the drop, her eyes fixed on a low, dark roof, half buried in a fold of the ridge, half a mile off and a little below. She reached that shack as the last white light failed, and inside its cold, dim room, her candle flame bent hard toward a seam between two short floorboards. Kneeling, she pried the first board up with the pole of a chipped axe, and beneath it, 5 earthen steps went down into a darkness that had been waiting 30 years for her hand. She was 22 and left for dead on the winter trail above Bracken Ridge. No family waiting for her anywhere below. No coin worth the naming pinned into her clothes. Just a tin locket at her throat on a braided horsehair cord and a borrowed wool coat with sleeves that did not quite reach her wrists. The two men who had put her there rode down the switchbacks without once looking back. Certain the cold would finish the work they had not the stomach to do with their own hands. What neither of them knew, what Sabra Merrow herself did not yet know, was that, half a mile off the ridge, tucked into a fold of the mountain the wind had nearly buried, stood an old line shack with a floor of wide pine plank. And beneath that floor, sealed behind a wooden peg and a low door, a small stone cellar had been waiting 30 years for someone exactly like her to lift 3 short boards and go down into the dark. Stay with me and tell me where you're watching from tonight. And keep close, because this one is worth the whole telling. Sabra Merrow had been born in a 2-room house on the flats below Bracken Ridge in the raw last week of March, the youngest child and the only daughter of a hired-out cattleman named Harlan Merrow, a man who worked other men's herds his whole life, and never in all his years owned a single foot of ground he could stand on and call his own. Her mother went to a fever the summer Sabra turned 6, and her 2 older brothers were scattered by wage work before she reached 10. One gone east to the grade crews, laying track through the low passes, the other south with a freight outfit into the dry country. Both of them swallowed up by the same great hunger for cheap labor that had already eaten their father down to the bone. Harlan did what men of his kind did in those years, which was to leave the girl with whoever would take her for a seasons and send back what little he could when the work paid out. So Sabra was raised in pieces, 5 months in one kitchen and 8 in another, learning young how to make herself useful at a stranger's table and how to keep her tongue behind her teeth when a woman who was not her mother spoke sharp across the room. The one place she was never once held as a stranger was the small holding of a widow named Docia Vane, who kept a pole-fenced garden and a dozen laying hens and a dry goods stall at the crossroads on market Saturdays. Docia was near 60 when Sabra first came to her, a square-built woman with knuckles like river stones and a habit of speaking only when the words would carry their own weight, and not a breath sooner. She took the girl in across 3 separate winters between the ages of 9 and 15, and she taught her the things a girl alone in that country would, one day, need if she ever meant to come through it whole. She taught her how to lay a fire that would hold live coals clear through the coldest night, and how to bank it come morning so the kitchen stayed warm to noon. She taught her to render tallow and cure a haunch and salt a hide, to read the weather off the bare shoulder of a mountain, to walk in deep snow without punching through the crust and spending all her strength in a single reckless mile. She named for her the plants that grew above the last of the timber, and told her which of them would carry a body alive from one town to the next when nothing else would. And without ever once folding it into a spoken sentence, she taught the girl that a woman who could keep her hands busy could keep the rest of herself whole. The only thing Docia ever gave her outright was that tin locket, plain as a nailhead, unmarked but for a single scratched letter D on the back, and folded inside it a small square of paper on which she had written, in her careful sloping hand, 2 words and nothing more. Be steady. Sabra was 15. The winter Docia died in her sleep between one market Saturday and the next, and it was Sabra who found her gone quiet and cold in the gray dawn, and Sabra who washed her and combed out her hair and laid her straight beneath a clean sheet before she walked the 4 miles back to her father's boarding room, with the locket already at her throat. She did not take it off again after that. Some griefs a person chooses to wear, where they can feel the shape of them against the skin. By the time she was 22, her father was 19 months in the ground himself, taken by a sickness in the lungs he had carried down out of a high winter camp, and the thin wages he had left behind in a leather pouch under a floorboard had gone to bury him and square a doctor's bill and settle a standing account at a mercantile. Sabra was working then as a hired girl in the household of a rancher named Silas Thorne, whose spread ran along the Cullen Fork below the ridge, and she kept his kitchen and his laundry and helped his wife mind the 2 small children of the house. She was paid in room and board and $3 a month, and what she could save of that she folded into a tobacco tin she kept behind the flour bin. And she believed, in the way young women of her circumstance were carefully taught to believe, that if she only stayed steady and useful and quiet, the work itself would carry her forward one day into something better than this. It was a reasonable belief. It was also the belief that set her, on a bright and bitter morning in the second week of December in the year 1884, on the winter trail above Bracken Ridge in the Montana Territory, in the company of 2 men who did not intend for her to come down off it alive. The turn came the way these turns always come, quietly and after dark. On the first Monday of December, Silas Thorne rode into the yard from 3 days at the stockyards in the low country, and he did not come into the kitchen for his supper the way he always had. Sabra heard him talking low with his wife in the front room for a long while, and the shape of that talk was not the shape of an argument. It was the shape of a decision already made, being explained to a woman rather than debated with her. And Sabra went on wiping down the stovetop and setting the bread to its second rise, because Docia Vane had told her once, plain as scripture, that a person who lingers at a closed door to hear their own name hears only the trouble in it and never the whole true shape of the thing. In the morning, Ellen Thorne came into the kitchen, with her hands folded flat against the front of her apron, and told Sabra, in the careful, even voice a woman uses when she has practiced the sentence at her mirror the night before, that the household would be reduced after the new year, and that Sabra's place could not be kept on. She did not look at Sabra while she said it. She looked at the breadboard, and at the salt cellar on the shelf, and at the calico curtain hanging over the wash bench, everywhere in that warm room except at the face of the girl who had scrubbed its floors for 14 months. Mr. Thorne had made an arrangement, she said. Sabra would be paid out her month and given a written character. 2 of the hired hands would take her over the ridge to the settlement at Sable Creek, where a family in need of a girl for the winter had agreed by letter to take her on. Thursday, weather permitting, and she left the kitchen without waiting to hear whatever the girl might have found to say. Sabra finished the bread. She kneaded it down and shaped the 2 loaves and set them near the warm iron to rise the last time, because the bread did not know that anything had changed, and there was no sense punishing it for her circumstances. Only when the loaves were in the oven, and the room had filled with the smell of yeast and heat, did she go into the pantry and take the tobacco tin down from behind the flour bin and open it there on the shelf. There had been $11.40 saved into it across 14 months of scrubbing and hauling and rising in the black cold before anyone else in the house had stirred. There were now $4.80. She stood a long moment with the tin in her 2 hands and did not make a sound, because Docia had told her that weeping in another woman's pantry was a thing a woman did only when she had given up on ever having a pantry of her own. She counted it a second time to be certain the count was true, And it was true. Then she pinned the $4.80 into the small cotton pouch she kept sewn inside her petticoat, and she set the empty tin back on the shelf exactly where it had stood, in the same ring of dust, so that whoever came looking after her would find nothing changed but the weight of it. On Thursday morning, the two hired hands were waiting in the yard with 3 saddled horses and a pack mule, blowing steam into the cold. She knew them by name and by almost nothing else. The older was a lean, long-jawed man called Cade Bellow, who had worked for Thorne off and on across 6 years and had never once spoken to her at the kitchen door except to hold out his cup for coffee. The younger was a boy of 19 named Rusk Denny, with a thin, uncertain beard coming in and a habit of laughing at things that were not funny, a laugh he swallowed the instant Bellow so much as turned his head. Sabra carried out her bundle, which held 2 dresses and a second pair of stockings, a wool shawl, a comb, a thin bar of lye soap, half a loaf wrapped in cheesecloth, and a hard sausage she had bought with her own coin. She wore her calico dress and her heaviest stockings and the borrowed wool coat that had belonged to Ellen Thorne's brother before he went east. And under her collar, cold against her breastbone, the tin locket rode where it always rode. Ellen Thorne came out onto the porch and put the written character into Sabra's mittened hand in its folded envelope. And she did not embrace her, and did not meet her eye, and went back inside before the horses were even turned. Silas Thorne did not come out at all. Cade Bellow lashed the bundle to the mule and told her to mount, the first words he had spoken to her that morning, and Sabra swung up onto the small bay mare they had brought for her and settled into a saddle worn smooth by other people's journeys. The 3 of them rode out of the yard at a walk, with the sun not yet clear of the ridge, and Sabra looked back once at the house where she had risen before dawn for 400 mornings, and then she did not look back at it again, because Docia had taught her that a road runs only the one way, and a body may as well set its face down the length of it. The trail up from the Cullen Fork climbs through pine timber for the first several miles before it breaks out into open switchbacks that run along the shoulder of Bracken Ridge in a long north-bearing traverse. The morning was hard and clear and very cold, the kind of cold that dries the inside of the nose and sets the pines to cracking in their own bark like distant rifle work. The snow along the trail was old snow, packed to ice on the shaded pitches and drifted soft where the sun had worked at it. Sabra rode behind Bellow and ahead of the Denny boy, and neither of them spoke to her, and she offered them nothing to answer. She watched the country instead, because a person who does not know where they stand has already surrendered half of what little they have, and she had no intention of surrendering the last thing left to her, which was her own bearings. She counted the drainages coming down off the ridge from the west and fixed the shape of each in her mind. She marked the burned snag standing black at the second switchback and the fir leaning out over the trail at the fourth. She saw where an elk cow had crossed with a single calf, both of them dropping toward lower feed, and where a bobcat had crossed behind them in the night and thought better of the chase and turned aside. Once, very far to the north, she saw a thin, dark thread of smoke rising off some cabin or camp she would never see, and she could not read what it meant, and she filed it away regardless. They stopped near noon, at a small flat where the trail bent around a granite shoulder, and a spring came out from beneath a slab in a black seam that had not frozen. Bellow let the horses drink, and gave her a hard biscuit from his own saddlebag, which she took and thanked him for, and Rusk Denny laughed at something the older man said too low for her to catch, and then went quiet fast when Bellow's look landed on him. Sabra ate the biscuit slow and drank from the spring out of her cupped hand. And she did not ask how far it was yet to Sable Creek, because she had already understood, in the way a body understands cold water before the mind consents to feel it, that they were not riding toward Sable Creek at all. Sable Creek lay east of Thorne's Spread and a little south of east, down toward the lower country where the wagon roads ran easy. They had been climbing north and bending west since dawn. The sun said so, low and to her left where it had no business being if east was the country they wanted. The drainages said so, each one opening the wrong way beneath them. The whole tilt of the ridge above her shoulder said so. She got back on the bay mare when Bello told her to, and she said nothing at all. Because there are moments when the only power left to a person is the power to not let the other party watch the moment land. By the middle of the afternoon, they had climbed above the last of the pine timber, out onto the bare-swept shoulder of the ridge, where the wind ran unbroken off the northwest and the snow lay in long white sheets between black outcrops of rock. The sky, hard and bright at dawn, had gone the color of skimmed milk. Cade Bello drew rein at a place where the trail widened into a shelf above a long, steep pitch that fell away into a valley. Sabra had never seen and could not name. He sat his horse a moment and looked down into it, the way a man looks at a thing he has already decided about and only wants to be sure of. Then he swung down out of the saddle, came around, and lifted her off the bay mare by the waist without a word, set her boots into the packed snow, and took the mare's reins out of her hand. Behind him, the Denny boy had already untied her bundle from the mule, and he carried it over and set it down in the snow at her feet and would not look at her while he did it. Mr. Thorne had asked them to see her over the ridge, Bello told her, and his voice was not cruel, and it was not kind. It was only finished, the voice of a man closing a ledger he did not expect to open again. This was the ridge. There was a wagon road, 3 days' walk down the valley to the north, that would fetch her to a rail town if she kept her feet under her and kept going. He wished her luck. He said it the way a man says a thing he does not believe will ever matter to him again. Then he stepped up into his saddle, turned his horse, and he and Rusk Denny rode back down the switchbacks the way the three of them had come. The boy looked over his shoulder just once, and even at that distance, Sabra could see it was not mercy in his face, but something smaller and more useless. And then he faced front and did not look again. The sound of the two horses in the packed snow grew fainter for a long time. Then it was gone entirely, and Sabra Merrow stood alone on the shoulder of Bracken Ridge with a bundle at her feet and the wind coming up hard out of the northwest. She stood there a full minute and no more, listening to the last of them go out of hearing. She did not scream after them, because a scream on that shoulder would only have cost her breath she was going to need. She did not sit down in the snow, because to sit down in that wind, in that failing light, with the cold dropping the way it was dropping, was to make a decision she was not willing to make and never would be. What she felt, standing there, was not despair. Despair is a thing a person can afford only when someone is coming to find them. What she felt instead was a cold, clean narrowing of the whole world down to the next hour, and the hour after that, and into that narrow space, unbidden, came Docia Vane's voice out of a kitchen hung with drying sage, telling her that a person who does not know where they stand has already surrendered half the fight. And Sabra knew where she stood. She stood above the last timber on the west shoulder of Bracken Ridge, the wind out of the northwest and running steady. The pine lines she had ridden up through, lying below and behind her to the south. And she knew one thing more. An hour before they crested this shelf, riding up through the last of the open switchbacks, she had marked a low roof set off the trail to the west, down in a fold of the ridge, a dark square against the snow, half a mile back and a little below. She had marked it the way Docia had drilled her to mark such things, without knowing why, only because it was there and might one day be wanted. And now the day had come to want it. If this story is settling into you already, the way these stories are meant to settle, go ahead and tell me down in the comments where you're watching from. Because I think you already know that this girl is going to turn her back on that drop and walk toward that roof. She bent and took the bundle up by its knot and drew the borrowed coat closer at her throat. And she turned away from the drop into the North Valley, away from the 3-day road that was no road at all for a girl, alone with the light going. And she started back along the way the horses had gone. She held the trail as far as the second bend she could still make out under the drifting, and there she left it, cutting down and west across the sheeted snow on the line she had built in her head an hour before. The crust held her weight for 3 steps and broke on the fourth and dropped her to the knee, and she dragged the leg free and went on. Because Docia had taught her that hurry in deep snow is only another name for exhaustion, and a body that fights the crust loses to it every single time. She kept the wind steady on her right cheek. She kept her 2 mittened hands closed hard on the knot of the bundle so the shaking in them would have something to do besides frighten her. She counted her breaths in fours, the way a person counts a fever down, and she did not stop. Because stopping was the one thing the mountain wanted from her. And somewhere back on the bay mare, she had decided she was finished handing people what they wanted from her for free. The light drained out of the sky in a slow, even way that had nothing to do with any cloud. The plain machinery of a December afternoon in the high country shutting itself down for the night. Her feet had gone from cold to burning to a distant wooden ache she recognized and did not like. Twice more the crust took her down, and twice more she got herself up. And once she stood a moment too long deciding whether to get up at all. And it was Docia's voice again, or the memory worn into the shape of it, that put her back on her feet, not with comfort but with a flat command she had once heard the old woman use on a balky mule. Then she came around the far side of a granite outcrop, and below her in the fold, sunk to its eaves on the wind-scored north side, its roof a black wedge laid against the last of the white light, stood the shack. It was a low building of squared timber, no more than 12 feet by 16, set with its long wall to the south and its door in that wall, where the winter sun would find it. The logs had silvered over the years to the gray of driftwood, and the pale clay chinking had fallen out of the north seams in long ropes, so that the whole north wall showed dark stripes where the wind had worked its patient way through. The roof was split, cedar shakes laid double, half the ridgeline gone soft with rot, a slow slump in the middle marking where a beam had sagged across the decades without ever quite giving way. A stovepipe of tin came up through the shakes at the east end, rust-crowned, braced with a twist of wire to a peg driven into the ridge. There was no window at all on the north. A single small window on the south had been boarded over from the inside with a piece of packing crate, and the boards were still sound. The door was 6 vertical planks held by 2 batten crosspieces, and a wooden latch on a leather thong, gone stiff and near black with age. And Sabra worked it with her frozen thumb until the latch lifted and the door came inward against a low drift, with a sound like a held breath let go. Inside it was dim and dry, colder than she had let herself hope and warmer by half than the wind at her back. She stood in the doorway a moment and let her eyes learn the room. The floor was pine plank, wide boards laid tight, and worn the deep brown of old tobacco, a shallow track worn pale between the door and the stove, where a lifetime of feet had gone back and forth. The stove was a small box of cast iron, no bigger than a bread crate, set up on 4 flat river stones, its door hanging open on a firebox swept clean and dry. A short stack of split pine leaned in the corner behind it, gray with dust but sound to the knock of her knuckle, and a tin can of splits and fine curled shavings sat waiting on the hearthstone as though someone had readied the morning's fire and then simply walked out of their whole life. Along the west wall, a plank bunk was built into the logs, a straw tick gone flat and brown across it, a folded blanket of coarse gray wool at the head. 2 wooden pegs above the bunk held a length of oiled canvas. A shelf ran the length of the north wall at shoulder height and carried a tin plate, a tin cup, a small iron skillet, whose broken handle had been mended with a tight wrap of wire, a stub of tallow candle standing in a saucer, and a rust-flecked tin of matches with a screw lid. In the corner leaned a short-handled axe with a chipped edge and a worn helve. Under the bunk, a wooden box held a coil of picture wire, a single bent horseshoe, and a tobacco tin heavy with square nails. Everything in that room had been left ready by someone who had fully meant to come back to it, and never had. Sabra shut the door behind her and dropped the wooden bar into its 2 cleats, and she heard the wind take hold of the door and find it barred. She pulled off her mittens with her teeth because her fingers would not work the cuffs. and she blew into her cupped palms. And she did not sit down. Not yet, because there was one thing in that room worth more than sitting. And she meant to have it first. She laid a fire in the little stove, the way Docia had shown her at 9 years old on a rainy afternoon she could still smell if she let herself. Shavings first in a loose nest, and the splits crossed above them so the flame could breathe. She took a match from the screw-lid tin and struck it on the cold iron, and cupped the small flame down into the shavings until they caught and licked upward and took the first split. She closed the stove door on a low yellow flame and heard the rusted tin stack overhead begin to draw with a thin whistling pull. The sweetest sound she had heard in a day full of hard ones, and only then, with the fire caught and the draw good and true, did she sit down on the edge of the plank bunk and put her hands flat on her knees and let the shaking come up through her at last and take her the way a fever takes a body, all the way to the teeth. The stove ticked as the iron warmed. After a while, the room began to give back a smell she had not known she was starving for. The smell of warming metal and warming pine and old dry wood coming awake, and Sabra got up off the bunk. Before the warmth could make her foolish, lit the stub of tallow candle off the open stove, and began to walk the whole perimeter of the floor with the little flame held low. She was looking for the mouse runs and the drafts and the soft places. Because Docia had taught her that in any house left unlived in the floor tells the truth first, before the walls will, and long before the roof. Under the north shelf the boards were sound and dry. Along the west wall by the bunk they were sound. But when she came around into the narrow space between the stove and the boarded south window, the candle flame leaned hard toward her all at once, bending as though someone had drawn a slow breath beneath the floor. And she went down onto her knees and held the flame lower still and felt the thin, cold seam of moving air rising up out of the join between two boards. Air that came from somewhere below the mountain, and not from the cold room around her. She set the candle in its saucer on the floor at her side and ran her cold fingertips along the seam. The boards there were shorter than their neighbors, cut clean square at both ends, and the nails that held them had been driven not down from above, where any eye would find them, but in at a slant from the sides. So their heads sat flush against the neighboring planks, and did not show at all unless a body was down on the floor in candlelight, looking for exactly the thing she was looking for. Sabra knelt a long moment over the short boards and the hidden nails, and something moved in her chest that was not the cold and was not fear. A small, hard flame of the same curiosity Docia used to watch kindle in her. Over a snared rabbit, or a strange track in the mud, the curiosity of a person who has learned that the world hides its truest things in plain and humble places, and rewards only the ones patient enough to kneel down and look for them. Whoever hid this, she thought, did not hide it from a thief. A thief they would have locked out with iron. This they had cut careful and left findable for a person willing to get down on the floor of a forgotten place and pay attention. She rose and crossed the room and took the short-handled axe from its corner and turned it, butt down. Set the flat of the pole against the near end of the first short board and levered, gently, the way you lift a thing you do not want to break. And the hidden nail came up out of the wood, with a small dry protest she felt in her wrist more than heard in her ear. The first board lifted, then the second, then the third came away in her two hands, and Sabra sat back on her heels and looked down into a square hole cut clean through the pine floor and framed round with hewn oak, and below the hole 5 earthen steps. Went down into the dark, and at the bottom of them stood a low plank door, set into a plank frame that had been fitted 30 years before, into the living rock of the mountain itself. She stayed on her heels a moment with one hand risen, without her willing it to the tin locket at her throat, the metal of it warm now from her own skin. Then she took up the candle in one hand, braced the other against the oak frame, and went down the 5 steps into a cold that smelled of nothing living. Only old wood and old dry earth and a faint far ghost of tallow, and she stood before the door. It was of the same pine as the floor above, gone dark and iron hard with the years, hung on 2 wrought strap hinges, and closed with a wooden peg through a hasp. There was no lock on it anywhere. And into the top plank, someone had cut with a knife, in careful upright letters that had waited in the dark for a light to find them, 4 words. To whoever finds this, and below them, smaller. Go gently. Sabra read the words twice by the candle, her breath smoking in the little flame's light. There is a particular silence that lives inside a place no one has spoken in for 30 years. And it is not an empty silence. It is a full one, crowded with everything that was ever meant to be said there. And she stood inside it a moment and felt it settle its whole weight onto her shoulders like a hand laid there in the dark. Then she drew the wooden peg out of the hasp and set it on the earthen step behind her and lifted the door open on its hinges. And the two of them, the girl and the door, made together a slow, low creak that had been lying coiled and waiting in that iron for 3 decades to be asked for. Whoever you are, sitting there in the warm and listening to me tell this, I want you to hold in your mind that she did not yet know what waited behind that door. She knew only that she had been left to die 2 hours before, had walked half a mile through the failing light, and had lifted 3 boards a wiser hand had left findable, and that whatever lay on the other side of this creek was the reason. The cellar behind the door was small, perhaps 6 feet on a side, cut into the rock and lined with plank on 3 of its walls. The air inside it was dry and still and colder than a well, and it smelled of old wood and old cloth and that same faint ghost of rendered fat. Sabra raised the candle. Along the far wall, a low pine shelf held 3 things ranged upon it, as neat as though a careful hand had set them out that very morning. A small wooden box of the kind that carries tea, bound in bright tin at every corner. A folded oilskin packet the size and heft of a family Bible. And a stoneware jar with a wooden lid, its rim sealed all the way around with a hard collar of poured wax. On the floor beneath the shelf sat a leather saddlebag, cracked along the fold and dark with age, and beside it a smaller canvas sack tied off at its neck with a length of hemp cord. Above the shelf, pinned to the plank with a single square nail, a sheet of paper had been left, yellowed and stiff as a dry leaf, written over in the same upright hand that had cut the words into the door. She took the paper down from its nail with the greatest care her cold fingers could manage, working the point free rather than tearing the brittle sheet. And she carried it, and the candle back up the 5 steps into the warming room and sat down cross-legged on the pine boards near the stove, close enough that the fire could reach her back, and unfolded the paper across her lap. It had been headed with a date, October the 9th, in a year she counted back and found to be 30 years gone. And it read to her in the small steady light, in a voice she could almost hear, rising up off the page, the way you hear a person's cadence in a letter they have written slow and meant every word of. My name is Docia Vane Ashby, it began, and I was born to a settled family in the state of Kentucky. And I came into this country in a wagon with my husband, Amos Ashby, and our 2 boys in the summer of my 24th year. Amos built this shack with his own 2 hands to hold a line camp on a claim we filed and proved together in the valley below, and we wintered up here 3 seasons and summered down in the meadow. And they were good years, better than I knew to be grateful for at the time. Amos was thrown from a horse and killed in the spring of our 4th year in these mountains. And I would have whoever reads this know that he did not suffer long, and that he lies buried beneath the biggest fir at the head of the meadow, where a body can hear the creek run all summer. The winter that followed, I understood I could not raise 2 young boys alone on a mountain that had already taken their father, and so I did the one right thing I had left in me to do. I sent them down out of the high country to my sister's people in the low farm country, where there were other children and a schoolhouse and warm rooms and grown folk enough to see them safe all the way to men. It was the hardest gladness of my life to watch that wagon carry them off, but they went whole and healthy and laughing at the freight mule, and I have had letters from them since in a hand that grows steadier each year. And that is the treasure of my whole life, and no gold ever pulled from any ground will touch it. Sabra read that part twice, and something in her throat pulled tight. because she had been one of the children the world scattered, and she knew in her bones the difference between a child cast off and a child sent safe. And she understood that this long-dead woman had chosen the second thing at a cost she could feel coming up off the page like heat off a stove. I stayed on here alone, another 6 years, the letter went on, and worked the claim and traded pelts at the settlement 2 days south. And I did well enough at it, better than a woman is supposed to do, which I will let stand as my own small boast. The claim is proved and patented and filed under my name at the land office at Fort Draymond, and the papers of it are in the oilskin on the shelf below this note. And I say plainly that they are good papers and that this ground belongs free and clear to whatever soul holds them. I am going down out of the mountain tomorrow to my sister's house, because my hands will not hold an axe the way they once did, and I do not mean to end my days alone, in the shack where my Amos and my boys were happy. What I am leaving in this room I am leaving on purpose. In the tea box is coin I saved out of 10 years of the pelt trade, $92 in gold and silver, honest money every cent. In the jar is lard I rendered clean this fall, and it will keep. In the saddlebag are Amos's tools, which are good tools, better than most men buy new, and were made to be used and not to lie in the dark. In the canvas sack is seed. I do not know who will come to this place, nor when, nor whether it will be in a year or in 50. I know only that the mountain sends someone, in the end, to every door left unlocked for them. I hope it is someone who has need of it. Be gentle with this place. It was loved. Signed, Orinda Vane Ashby, this 9th day of October. Sabra sat on the pine floor with the letter open across her knee and did not move for a long while, and the stove ticked, and the wind came around the eaves and went on down the fold, and the candle burned lower in its saucer. Orinda Vane Ashby, she said aloud, once, into the empty warming room, and the name went out into the air and did not come back, and hung there in the small space between the two of them across 30 years. She raised her hand and closed her cold fingers around the tin locket at her throat, feeling through the last of the numbness, the scratched letter D against the pad of her thumb. And she understood, with no evidence at all beyond a surname sitting there on a dead woman's letter, and the whole scattered shape of her own life, that Docia Vane, who had taken her in across 3 winters and taught her every last skill by which she had just now come down off a killing ridge alive, had come out of the very same Kentucky veins as the woman who had left this room to whoever the mountain should send. 2 women out of 1 people, 30 years and 1,000 miles of hard road apart, and neither one had ever laid eyes on the other. And between the 2 of them, without ever meaning to, and without either one ever knowing it, they had built a bridge across a mountain and a lifetime. And Sabra Merrow had just walked out onto the middle of it in a borrowed coat with $4.80 pinned inside her petticoat. She thought about that a long time, turning it slow. The way you turn a stone you have found that is heavier than it has any right to be. She thought about how Docia had drilled her, over and over past the edge of a child's patience, to mark a roof glimpsed once from a trail, to read the tilt of a ridge against the sun, to lay a fire that would draw clean, and how not one of those lessons had ever made sense to her as anything but an old woman's fussing until this single day had come and called every one of them due at once. It was as though Docia had spent 3 winters quietly loading a rifle whose trigger she would never live to pull, trusting some stranger down the years to be there and to be steady when the moment finally came. A person builds their truest legacy, not out of the gold they leave behind, but out of the hands they take the time to teach, and the hands go on doing the good work long after. The teacher is only a name, and a letter scratched into a bit of tin. She did not weep. She had wept for Docia at 15 and did not have it in her to weep again, not that night, not with the fire needing tending, and her feet not yet fully back from the ridge, and a whole cold world of tomorrow waiting past the boarded window. What she did instead was rise, stiff-jointed, cross to the shelf, take down the oilskin packet, and unfold it there in the candlelight, and she found inside it a folded set of filing papers written in a clerk's careful copperplate and stamped, in faded but readable ink, with the seal of the land office at Fort Draymond, and a date 30 years gone, and a name. She could not read the whole of the legal language by a candle stub. And she did not try, but she read the name, and she read the word patented, and she read the figure of the acreage, and she folded the papers back into their oilskin, with hands that had stopped shaking somewhere in the last hour without her noticing. And she understood the size of the things she was holding in the dark. The shack was not worthless. The shack had never once been worthless. A tired man's cast-off girl, driven up a mountain to freeze in a place nobody wanted, had come down half a mile off the trail and lifted 3 short boards, and under the floor of the thing nobody wanted lay the one thing she had never in 22 years dared to want out loud, which was a piece of ground with her own 2 feet planted on it and papers in a drawer that said so. She set the oilskin back on the shelf beside the tea box and the sealed jar, and she banked the little stove down to a low red seam the way Docia had taught her so the room would still hold some warmth. Come the black middle of the night, and she blew out the candle stub to save it, because a person who has just been handed a future does not squander good tallow staring at it in the dark. She lay down on the plank bunk with the coarse gray blanket pulled over the borrowed coat, her boots still on, because her feet were not yet certain enough to trust bare to the cold, and she listened to the fire settle, and the wind work the north seams, and the whole old sound of a mountain in December closing down around a lit and living room. Somewhere below her in the low country, Silas Thorne was sitting at his own supper by his own fire, believing he had solved a small problem cheaply. Somewhere on the road down, Cade Bellow and the Denny boy were riding into the dark, one of them not thinking of her at all, and the other thinking of her in a way that would not let him sleep. And she thought of them without heat, the way you think of weather that has already crossed the ridge and can no longer reach you because they had believed they were setting a girl down to vanish. And what they had done instead, without the first idea of it, was aim her like a struck compass at the one door in all that country that had been left unlocked, and waiting 30 years for her hand to lift its latch. The stove held its small, even breath in the dark. Above the bunk on the shelf, the letter lay folded where she had set it, and beside it the oilskin with its good papers, and beyond the wall the snow came down straight and quiet. Over the cedar shakes an old man's hands had split and laid, over the fold of the mountain, over the buried meadow, where a fir stood at the head of a frozen creek, over the whole silent country that did not yet know it had a new soul living in it, who intended, come the first gray light, to rise and begin. Morning came gray and hard against the boarded window, and Sabra woke with her breath hanging visible above the bunk, and the fire gone to cold ash. She lay still a moment and took stock of her own body the way Docia had taught her to take stock of a room, from the outside in. Her feet had come back. They ached in the joints, and the smallest toe on the left throbbed with a deep bruise she did not remember earning. But they were her feet again, and they would carry her. Her fingers worked. There was a raw split at the corner of her mouth from the wind, and a stiffness across her shoulders from the way she had slept braced against the cold. But she was whole, and being whole after a day like the one behind her was itself a kind of wealth she had not expected to wake into. She rebuilt the fire before she did anything else, because a person who lets the fire die twice in one hard country has not yet understood the country. When the stove was drawing again and the first thin warmth came off the iron, she pulled on her mittens, worked the bar off the door, and shouldered it open against the night's new snow. And she stood in the low doorway, looking out at the world she had come into blind the evening before. It was a white morning under a sky the color of a dirty fleece. The fold of the mountains sunk all around her in fresh drift, and the meadow the letter had spoken of fell away below to the south, a long white bowl rimmed with dark timber. And at the head of it, unmistakable even under snow, stood a single fir far taller than its neighbors, black against the pale slope. She looked at that tree a while. Amos Ashby lay beneath it, a man 30 years dead, whom she would never know beyond the shape of his tools and the pitch of the roof he had split. And she found she was glad to know where he lay, because a place is a different place once you know who loved it, and she had inherited both the place and the loving of it in a single night. The first work was the roof, because everything else in that room depended on the roof, and she had felt the soft slump of the ridgeline overhead the night before, without letting herself think about what the first thaw would make of it. She climbed onto the bunk, and from the bunk onto the north shelf, easing her weight where the plank would take it, and reached up with the handle end of the broom she found leaning behind the door and pressed it against the underside of the rotted ridge, until she found the places where the wood gave soft as wet bread beneath the point. She marked each soft place in her mind. When the snow melted and ran, it would come in there, and worst of all, at the low center of the slump, straight down onto the bunk where she slept. And a wet bed in that country was not a discomfort. It was the first door a sickness walks through, and a body alone could not afford to hold that door open. She came down off the shelf, knowing what the next days would ask of her, and she was almost glad of the knowing, because a clear task is a mercy to a person who has spent a year being told to wait quietly for a future that turned out to be a lie. She took a full inventory then, laying each thing out on the plank table in the growing light so she could see the whole of what she had been left. From Amos Ashby's cracked saddlebag came a felling axe, with a hickory helve gone dark and smooth with a dead man's sweat, a hand adze, a 2-pound hammer, a wide wood chisel, a small bit and brace with 3 good bits, a whetstone worn hollow in the middle, a coil of tarred hemp twine, a leather awl, a horseshoe rasp, a can of tallow sealed under a wooden lid and folded inside an oiled rag, 6 iron files kept from rust with the care most men gave to money. She ran her thumb along the felling axe's edge and found it dull with disuse but not pitted steel that had been good steel when it was new and had only been waiting. These were not the tools of a man who bought cheap and replaced often. They were the tools of a man who had meant to be buried in the country he cleared with them, and had been. From the canvas sack came seed and twists of brown paper, each one marked in Arinda's upright hand, and Sabra read them one at a time and set them in a row. Turnip, cabbage, kale, onion, pole bean, and a heavier twist than the rest, marked with a single word, corn. She held that one a moment. Corn was a summer and a whole growing season away. Corn was a promise a person made to a piece of ground they intended to still be standing on come September, and the fact that Arinda had left it, that she had sealed a future harvest into a cellar for a stranger not yet born, told Sabra more about the woman than the $92 ever could. Coin is what a person leaves behind when they are afraid. Seed is what they leave when they still have hope. And Arinda Vane Ashby had walked down off her mountain with hope enough to spare for a girl she would never meet. She pried the wax collar off the stoneware jar with the awl and lifted the wooden lid, and the smell that came up was clean, only a thumb's depth of gray, gone at the very top, and beneath it the pale, sweet fat, exactly as it should be, 30 autumns old and still good, because Arinda had rendered it right and sealed it right, and the cold cellar had kept faith with her across all those years. Sabra took 2 spoonfuls of it, straight away for the heat it would put in her, and it sat in her belly like a small banked coal. And she understood she was not going to starve in the near days, which freed her mind at last to worry about the far ones. For 6 days she did not leave the fold. She melted snow in the wire-mended skillet for her water, cut the last of the stale bread into careful rations, chewed the hard sausage a thin slice at a time, ate her 2 spoons of the good lard morning and night, and she worked. She sharpened the felling axe first, sitting on the edge of the bunk with the hollow-worn whetstone and drawing the edge across it in the slow circular strokes Docia had shown her at 9, spitting on the stone to raise the slurry until the steel would shave a line of pale hairs off her own forearm and leave the skin smooth behind it. A dull tool is a dangerous one, Docia used to tell her, because a dull tool makes a body force it, and a forced tool is the one that slips and finds you. Sabra had not understood that as a child. She understood it now, alone on a mountain where a slipped axe and a bad cut could end her as surely as the ridge had meant to. She went out in the middle hours of each day, when the weak sun stood highest and the cold loosened its grip an inch, and cut standing dead pine from the timber above the shack, dropping each small trunk with the sharpened axe and dragging it back to the door, one length at a time, on a loop of the tarred twine slung over her shoulder. She split the wood small enough for the little box stove, and stacked it in the corner where the old gray stack had stood, and she watched her own new-cut wood rise beside the 30-year dust of Arinda's last stacking. And there was a strange and steadying company in that. Two women's winters leaning together against the same wall. The chinking she did from the inside, working down from the top course, the way you always work a wall, so the day's labor does not fall out from under the next day's. She pulled the old fallen clay from the north seams, with her fingers where she could reach it, and dug more from a bank below the spring seep, where the ground had not frozen hard. Warmed water on the stove, worked the clay with dry pine needles for binding, and a little of the good lard to help it hold and shed water, and packed it into the dark stripes of the north wall with her thumbs and the flat of a chisel, until the wind that had walked through that wall for a decade had to go around instead. Each seam she closed made the room hold its heat a little longer into the night, and she measured her progress not in feet of wall, but in the slow lengthening of the time the stove could go untended before the cold crept back in. On the fourth day, she cut fresh cedar shakes for the roof. There was a windfall cedar in the timber above, a big tree the mountain had laid down some winters past, and she found the grain of it ran straight and clean, and she split shakes off it with the hand adze and a length of hardwood for a mallet, working slow because a rived shake is a thing of patience, and a hurried one splits wrong and is wasted. By the sixth day she had a stack of good shakes leaned against the south wall to dry, and she had climbed up onto the roof itself in the flattest hour of the day, roped to the stovepipe brace so a slip would not carry her off the eave, pulled the worst of the rotted shakes free, laid her fresh ones in their place, double-lapped the way Amos had laid the originals, and nailed them home with the square nails from the tin under the bunk. When she came down off the roof in the failing light and stood back to look at the patch, 4 feet across, over the worst of the slump, pale new cedar against the old silver, she felt something she had not felt in the whole of her hired years. The plain, flat pride of a thing made right by her own hands that would keep the weather off her own head. She spoke aloud sometimes as she worked, because the silence in that fold was a great and patient thing, and a person's own voice was a comfort against it. And she found she was talking to Docia as often as not, reporting her work the way she once had at 9 and 11 and 15. The stack draws clean now, she told the empty air, packing a chisel load of clay into a seam. You'd not find fault with this wall. And once, standing on the roof with a cedar shake in her hand and the whole white country falling away below her, she set it out to no one, to the woman under the fir and the woman 1,000 miles gone, that she meant to keep it, that she meant to keep every last foot of it. And the wind took the words down the meadow and gave nothing back, but she had not said them to be answered. She had said them to make them true in the saying, the way you drive a stake to hold a line against a pull you cannot yet see. Have you ever laid a fire and known, just by the sound the flue makes as it takes the draft, that it was going to hold clean through the night? There is a knowing that lives in the hands before it ever reaches the head, a wisdom the fingers keep that no book ever put there. And if you carry that knowing, if some grandmother or some old neighbor once stood at your shoulder and worked it into your hands a task at a time, then you already understand something about this girl that the men who left her on the ridge never once suspected, which is that she was never nearly as alone as they had meant her to be. Tell me down in the comments whether you have ever known a thing by the smell or the sound of it that no page could have taught you. I think a good many of you have, and I think it is the finest inheritance a person can be handed in this life. On the 10th day, the wind swung around to the south, and the quality of the cold changed, softening at its edges, and by afternoon, the eaves were dripping, and the crust on the meadow had gone from a hard glaze to a wet sag underfoot, and Sabra knew, the way Docia had taught her to know, that the trail down would open before the high passes did, and that she had a narrow window to make Fort Draymond and come back before the next weather closed the door. She could not simply stay on the mountain and hold the shack by sleeping in it. The papers were good. Orinda had said so, and the seal said so. But a paper's goodness meant nothing at all until it was carried down to the office that had made it and spoken for in front of the men who kept the ledgers. And until then, she was only a girl squatting in a dead woman's cabin with a claim she could not prove to a living soul. The mountain had handed her the treasure. The valley would decide whether she got to keep it. She packed for the walk with the same care she now gave to everything. Into a grain sack, she folded the oilskin packet of filing papers, and out of the tea box she counted 40 of Orinda's $92, leaving the rest sealed back into the cellar. Because a person does not carry their whole future in a single sack down an unknown road. She added her own $4.80 and the written character from Ellen Thorne, still folded in its envelope and unopened, kept only because Sabra did not throw paper away, and because a character, even one given by people who had tried to be rid of her for good, was a thing the world set store by. She cut a wedge of the good lard and wrapped it in oilcloth for her journey's food, along with the very last of the sausage. The locket she did not pack, because the locket did not travel in a sack. The locket rode where it always rode, at her throat under her collar with the scratched D against her skin. She barred the shack door from the outside as best she could, wedging a stout plank up under the outer latch so the wind could not work it open, nor the snowdrift in and spoil what she was leaving. And she stood a moment with her hand flat on the silvered planks Amos Ashby had hung and made the door a promise she meant to keep. Then she turned south and started down along the ridge on the same road. Orinda had walked it down 30 years before, 2 days south to the settlement, and she walked it in the softening snow with the grain sack on her back and the felling axe in her hand, because a tool that good does not sit alone in an empty house while its owner walks unarmed through country she does not yet know. She slept the first night in a stand of fir where the ground lay dry beneath the low branches. A small fire built behind a rock so its light would not carry, banked careful and fed small, and she woke stiff but rested and went on before the sun cleared the ridge. On the afternoon of the second day, the pines opened out, and she came down onto a wagon track rutted deep by freight wheels, and she followed the ruts west into the settlement at Fort Draymond. And she came into it on foot with an axe in her hand and a sack on her back. A girl the town had never seen, walking in out of the high country where it had killed grown men for far less than she had just survived. The land office at Fort Draymond was a single room with a plank counter and a coal stove and a wall of leather-bound ledgers, kept by a clerk named Elias Poole, a thin, slow-moving man of near 60, who had sat behind that counter the better part of 21 years and watched a whole territory fill in around him, one filed claim at a time. Sabra set the oilskin packet on the counter, opened it flat, and said no more than her name and where she had come from, because Docia had taught her that a person who explains too much before they are asked is a person who does not trust their own case. Elias Poole read the filing papers through a pair of wire spectacles, slow, his lips moving faintly over the legal language, then read them a second time, then set them down and looked at her over the tops of the lenses a moment without a word, and rose and went to his wall of ledgers and took down a heavy volume marked with the year Orinda had written her letter. He turned the pages the better part of a quarter hour, and Sabra stood at the counter and did not fidget and did not fill the silence. And the coal stove ticked, and a fly woke somewhere in the warmth and battered itself against the window glass. When Poole at last looked up, he told her that the claim had been filed and proved and patented, and never once struck from the books, that it stood in the ledger clean as the day it was first entered, and that no tax had been laid against that ground in the whole of her lifetime, because no one had ever come forward to be taxed for it. His finger rested on the open page. If she could show relation to the woman named on the patent, he said, or an instrument of conveyance bearing that woman's own hand, the ground would carry to her whole and free. But the office could not simply hand a patented homestead to any soul who walked in off the mountain holding the papers, however good the papers were, because papers could be found and papers could be stolen, and the ledger did not know the difference between an heir and a thief. It would want a witness of the family line and a magistrate's seal, and those could be got, in his estimate, in about 6 weeks if she was a patient person. Sabra said that she was a patient person, and Elias Poole almost smiled at that and did not quite, and wrote her name on a sheet of foolscap, and beneath it, when she gave them, the name Docia Vane and the name Orinda Vane Ashby. And he looked at the two Vanes sitting one above the other on his page a moment longer than the writing of them had required. Family, he said, half to himself, and Sabra said she believed so, but could not yet prove it, and that the proving of it was the very thing she had come down the mountain to begin. He gave her a receipt for the papers, which he would keep locked in his drawer against loss. And he told her that the witness was the hard part, that a woman 30 years in the ground did not have many living kin who could stand up and swear to a bloodline, and that Sabra had best turn her whole mind to finding one, because without a witness the finest patent in the territory was only so much ink drying on a page. She took a room that night above the feed store for 15 cents, kept by a widow named Verna Tibbet, 44 and 6 years alone, who set a bowl of bean soup with a cut onion floating on top in front of her, and did not ask where she had come from, or why she had carried an axe into a boarding house, which told Sabra that Verna Tibbet had learned the same lesson she had, that a woman alone learns not to ask the questions she would not want asked back at her. In the morning, Sabra went to the mercantile and spent $7 with a careful hand on flour and cornmeal and salt and coffee and dried apples, a paper of tea and a bar of yellow soap, a bolt of unbleached muslin for a shift, thread and needles, a new hatchet head to replace the chipped short axe up at the shack, a small crock, and 8 hens' eggs packed in bran in a tin pail with a wire handle. The mercantile was kept by a man named Othos Sedge, 61, gone gray and stooped, and when Sabra named whose kin she was trying to trace, when she said the name Docia Vane aloud across his counter, something moved in the old man's face. He had known Docia Vane. Years back, he told her, setting down the paper of tea he had been about to wrap. Docia Vane had kept a dry goods stall at the crossroads and come through Fort Draymont twice a year to lay in her stock, and she had once stood in this very store and dressed down a drummer selling watered lamp oil until the man packed his case and left town a full day early. Otho Sedge laughed at the memory, a dry sound like a door on a rusted hinge, and he gave Sabra the eggs at cost and threw in a length of good tarred cord besides. And he said that any girl Docia Vane had had a hand in raising was a girl worth the extending of a little credit to, and that if she meant to hold ground up on the ridge, she would want to talk to a freighter named Newt Farrow, who ran a 2-mule wagon up toward the high country twice a month and knew that whole side of the mountain the way a man knows the back of his own hand. Sabra loaded her purchases into the grain sack and shouldered it, heavier now than it had come down, and started back up the wagon track before noon, because the window in the weather would not hold open for her convenience. She was 2 hours out of Fort Draymond, laboring under the load with the axe through her belt, when a 2-mule freight wagon overtook her on the track and drew up alongside, and the man on the seat, weathered and unhurried, with a face like a piece of cured hide, asked if she wanted a lift as far as the fork. He had heard in town that morning, he allowed, about the girl with the 30-year papers, and he had a load going up that way regardless. This was Newt Farrow, 37, who ran his wagon between the settlements and missed very little of what moved on the road, and he took her up onto the seat and would not hear of a coin for it, and as the mules leaned into the grade, he told her plainly what Elias Poole had told her more gently, that holding a patent was one thing, and holding the ground beneath it another thing entirely, and that she had best know before she climbed any higher up that mountain that the ground under Orinda Ashby's patent had not been sitting empty all these years, whatever the ledger said. Sabra turned on the wagon seat and looked at him, and the cold that came into her had nothing to do with the weather. What did he mean? She asked him that it had not been sitting empty. Newt Farrow kept his eyes on the mules and told her that Silas Thorne, whose kitchen she had scrubbed for 14 months, had for a good 10 summers now run cattle up into the High Valley below the ridge, driven them up in June and gathered them down in September, and grazed that meadow and that timber as if it were his own open range, and never a fence nor a filing to say him no. Free grass, Farrow said, is the sweetest grass a rancher ever tastes, and a man gets to thinking, after enough summers of it, that the sweetness of a thing is the same as the owning of it. Thorne had come to think of that whole valley as good as his, and there were men in the low country who thought so, right along with him, because a man who uses a thing openly for 10 years and is never once told no begins to look like the owner of it in every eye but the law's. She rode the rest of the way to the fork in silence, turning that over, and it changed the whole shape of the thing she was carrying up the mountain. She had thought her enemy was the ridge and the winter and 6 weeks of patience. Now she understood. Her enemy was a living man with cattle and hired hands and standing in the country, a man who had already once decided she was a problem by sending her up a mountain to freeze, and who would not take it kindly at all when word reached him that she had lived, that the girl he had thrown away now held on paper the very ground he had grown fat grazing for free. The treasure under the floor had a price hung on it, after all, and the price was going to be paid up here in the daylight, in front of witnesses, against a man with every reason in the world to wish she had stayed lost on that shelf. Newt Farrow set her down at the fork and would not take her thanks any more than her coin. And he told her that if she meant to keep the shack, he would carry a load of milled boards up in the spring for the price of the trip, which he named as $1.50, and Sabra shook his hard hand across the wagon seat and told him she would hold him to it. And he nodded once and drove his mules on and left her standing at the fork with her heavy sack and her new knowledge and a mile still to climb. She came up to the shack in the last light to find the wedged plank still holding the door and the roof patch shedding the day's melt in a clean line off the fresh cedar, and she went in and built up the fire and set the eggs into a straw nest in the wooden box under the bunk. And she sat a long while at the plank table in the dark before she lit the candle, thinking of about Silas Thorne. She had left his house believing him a hard, practical man who had done a hard, practical thing. She saw now it had been worse than practical. A man reduces a household and turns off a girl he can no longer use. He does not send 2 hands to walk her up a killing ridge in December and set her down above a drop to freeze. That second thing was not economy. That second thing was a man clearing something off a piece of ground, and though she could not yet name what it was she had become to him, she understood in her bones that her survival was not merely an inconvenience to Silas Thorne. It was a danger, and a girl who has become a danger to a powerful man had best build her walls high and her case tight, because such a man does not lose gracefully and does not lose quietly. Through the back half of that week, she gave herself to the work of turning from a shack, from a shelter, was merely surviving in, into a house she could hold. Because a claim, she had begun to understand, was not only a paper in a drawer, but a manner of living that the whole country could look at and read plain. A squatter passes through and leaves the place as they found it. An owner digs in and marks the ground as theirs. She cut a north window into the log wall at shoulder height, with the bit and brace and the wide chisel, boring a line of holes and knocking out the waste between them, and dressing the opening square, framed it in hewn pine, and glazed it for now with oiled paper, stretched tight on a light frame that would take a proper pane come spring. And the gray daylight that came through it changed the whole feeling of the room, made it a place a person lived in by choice, and not only by need. She built a small lean-to against the east end for a woodshed out of unmilled poles and the shakes left over from the roof. so her wood would stay dry through the wet months. She laid a path of flat stones between the door and the spring, seep 30 yards down the fold, prying each stone from the half-frozen ground and setting it level, so that when the thaw turned the fold to mud, she could still fetch water without sinking to the ankle at every step. It was on an afternoon near the end of that work, the light going amber over the western timber and Sabra up to her wrists in the cold run of the seep rinsing clay from her hands, that she heard it. A sound that did not belong to the fold. The wrong sound entirely, the sound of a shod horse coming up through the timber at a walk. She went still with the water running gray off her fingers. No one came up here. Newt Farrow came to the fork and no farther. No one in that country had reason to climb into this dead-end fold below the ridge, except a man whose cattle grazed the meadow below, and who might send a rider up to look over his summer range, even in the dead of a mild December spell. She rose from the seep slow and did not run, because running is a thing the eye catches and holds, and she moved back toward the shack, keeping the woodshed between herself and the sound, and she took up the felling axe from where it leaned by the door. Not as a weapon, she told herself, only as a thing to have in the hand. And she waited. The rider came out of the timber at the lower edge of the fold and drew rein. And she knew him at once by the long jaw and the lean set of him in the saddle. And the recognition went through her like cold water poured down the spine. Cade Bellow. The same man who had lifted her off the bay mare on the shelf above the drop and set her boots in the snow and closed his ledger on her life. He sat his horse at the edge of the fold and looked at the shack, and she watched his eyes go to the fresh cedar on the roof and to the smoke standing up thin and straight from the mended stovepipe, and to the new-cut poles of the woodshed, and she watched the whole meaning of it arrive in his face. His horse shifted under him. For a long moment neither of them moved, the man on the horse at the edge of the trees and the girl by the door with the axe hanging loose in her hand. 30 feet and one impossible fact standing in the air between them. He had been sure she was dead. She could see that certainty come apart behind his eyes, could watch him doing the arithmetic no man wants to do, the arithmetic of a thing you help to bury standing up again in the daylight and looking back at you. His mouth opened and shut. When he finally found his voice, it did not carry the finished, ledger-closing flatness it had carried on the ridge. It carried something rawer, something nearer to fear. He had thought, he said, and stopped and started again. They had told him she would have walked north to the rail town. Nobody had said. His eyes went again to the smoke, to the roof, to the impossible thriving proof of her, and the sentence died in his throat, because there was no honest end to it that did not amount to a confession spoken aloud in the open air. Sabra did not lift the axe, and she did not lower it. She stood square in front of the door of the house she had made, and let him look, and when she spoke, her voice came steady, in a way that surprised even her low and even, and carrying no more heat than the winter air between them. He had set her down to die, she told him, and the mountain had handed her a home instead, and now he could ride back down and tell whoever had sent him whatever he pleased. But he should tell them true, that the girl they left on Bracken Ridge was alive and well and standing on ground that belonged to her, with papers in Fort Draymond to prove every word of it. She watched the word papers land on him, watched him understand that this was no longer a matter of a girl who might starve quietly somewhere out of sight, that there was ink in it now, and a clerk and a ledger with her name working its way steadily into it, and that the thing they had tried to make vanish had instead put down roots and grown itself a set of teeth. Bellow looked at her a long moment more, and something worked in his face that might have been the first turning of shame, or might only have been the cold reckoning of his own exposure. And then he turned his horse without another word, and put it back down into the timber, and she listened to the shod hooves go down through the trees and away, faster going down than they had come up. She stood by the door until the last of the sound was gone, and only then did she let the axe head sink to the ground and lean the helve against the wall, and she found her hands were not quite steady. not from any fear of the man himself, but from the clear, cold knowledge of what his going meant. Within a day, two at the most, Silas Thorne would know. He would know she had lived, that she held the valley on paper, that she meant to keep it. The quiet 6 weeks of patience Elias Poole had promised her were gone. Whatever was coming would come faster now, and it would not come gently, because she had just sent a frightened man down a mountain to tell a dangerous one that the girl he had erased was standing on the very ground he coveted, with the law turning, slow and sure, her way. Silas Thorne did not come himself, and that was the first thing that told Sabra how the fight would be waged. She had braced through 2 hard days for the sound of many horses in the timber, for a man's voice raised in the fold demanding she come out, and instead, what came, on the third morning after Bello rode down, was a single folded paper carried up by a boy on a mule from the fork, a boy who would not meet her eye and left the moment she took it from his hand. She opened it at the table by the light of the oiled paper window. It was a notice, written out in a lawyer's tidy script, informing her that the land she occupied was subject to a prior and established claim of use held by Silas Thorne, that her presence upon it constituted a trespass, and that she was directed to quit the premises within 30 days or face proceedings at law. There was no threat of violence anywhere in it. There did not need to be. A man who has learned that the courts will do his breaking for him has no further use for his own hands. She read it twice and understood the shape of what he had chosen. He was not going to ride up and be seen driving a girl off a mountain, not now, not with a clerk in Fort Draymond already holding papers with her name working into them. He was going to do it in daylight, in an office, in front of the very men whose good opinion he had spent 20 years buying, and he was going to dress the whole thing up to look like law. That was the more dangerous road by far, because a bruise heals and a grave can be dug up. But a judgment entered in a ledger stands forever, and against a judgment a girl had no axe worth the swinging. She folded the notice and set it on the shelf beside Orinda's letter. The cruelty of the one lying flat against the kindness of the other. 30 years and 2 hearts apart. The thing that frightened her in it was not the 30 days. It was the phrase established claim of use. Newt Farrow had told her plainly what those words meant down on the ground. 10 summers of Thorne cattle, fattening on free grass, and she understood now that Thorne meant to stand those 10 summers up in a courtroom as if they were a kind of ownership. To argue that a man who has used a thing openly and unopposed for a decade has earned a right in it no dead woman's paper could override. She did not know the law, but she knew men, and she knew that a lie told with confidence by a rich man, in a room full of his creditors and his friends, has a way of becoming true enough to ruin a person who cannot answer it. Orinda's patent was the stronger thing. But the stronger thing does not always carry the day. The thing that carries the day is the thing that has a living soul standing beside it to speak for it. And Orinda had lain 30 years silent under a chestnut tree in the low country, and Sabra had not one living person who could swear before a magistrate that she was who she said she was. She went down to Fort Draymond again the moment the weather held, walked the 2 days south with the notice in her sack, laid it on Elias Poole's counter, and watched the old clerk read it through his wire spectacles with his mouth going thin. He set it down at last and told her, in the flat, careful way of a man who has watched the law used as a club before, that Thorne's paper was noise and not much more, that a claim of use had no standing whatever against approved and patented homestead, that the ground was Orinda Ashby's in the ledger and would pass to Orinda Ashby's proven kin and to no one else, cattle or no cattle. That was the good news, he said, and then he took off his spectacles and rubbed the bridge of his nose, because he was not a man who left a person comfortable with half a truth. The bad news was that none of it counted for anything until she could prove the blood, and that Silas Thorne knew as well as any man in the territory that a witness was the one thing she did not have, which was precisely why he had chosen to make his fight on that ground and no other. He was not wagering that his claim was the stronger. He was wagering that she could not prove hers at all. and that when the magistrate asked her to show her right, and she stood there unable, the patent would sit in the ledger unclaimed, and a man of standing with summers of use behind him would find it a very short walk from there to a quiet arrangement that put the whole valley into his hands for good. Prove the blood. She turned the two words over on the long walk back up the mountain, and they grew heavier with every mile. She had a surname on a locket and the same surname on a letter, and a certainty lodged in her own chest, and not one of those three was worth a thing in a courtroom. Docia Vane had died with no children of her own, no husband living, no family that had ever come to that crossroads to claim her or bury her. Orinda Ashby had sent her two boys down out of the high country 30 years past to a sister's people somewhere in the low farm country. And Sabra did not know the sister's name, nor the town, nor whether any soul of that whole line was still drawing breath under the sun. Somewhere down in the flat lands to the south and east, there might be a person who could stand up and swear the Vanes of Kentucky were one family. Or there might be no one left at all, and the bridge she had walked out onto might have no far end, might simply stop in open air over a 30-year gap that no living witness could ever close. She did not let it stop her, because a person who waits for the whole of the road to show itself before they take the first step never once leaves the porch. She wrote to Elias Poole and asked him to search whatever records the office held for any filing, any transfer, any deed, anywhere in the territory that bore the Vane name. And she went to Othosege at the Mercantile, who had known Toka in the flesh, and asked him everything he could dredge up of what the old woman had ever said of her people. Sedge scratched at his gray jaw and remembered slowly, the way an old man remembers, a word here and a word there. Docia had spoken once of a niece, or a cousin's girl. He could not be sure which, married into a farming family down toward the rail country south of the Low Divide. He could put no name to her. But he gave Sabra the direction of her, and the direction was more than she had walked in with, and she took it the way a person takes up the first plank of a bridge they mean to build the rest of by hand and by faith. The weeks that followed were the hardest she had known on the mountain, harder than the first days of plain survival, because survival at least had been a thing her hands could set themselves to. And this was a waiting she could not fill with work. The thaw came on in earnest. The meadow below turned from white to a sodden brown. The creek ran high and loud, and one gray afternoon, Sabra stood at her new window and watched the thing Newt Farrow had warned her of, and she had half hoped he was wrong about. Down in the wet meadow, small with distance, a rider was pushing a scatter of cattle up out of the low country and into the valley. Thorn cattle, the T-brand plain on their hips, even at that range, driven up onto her ground in the open face of the notice he had sent her. As if to say his 30 days ran both directions, and he would keep grazing what he called his until a court told him otherwise. It was a message, and she read it clean. He was not waiting on the law. He was turning his 10 summers into an 11th before her eyes, laying down more of the very evidence he meant to stand on, daring her to ride down and try to stop a thing she had not the power on earth to stop. She did not ride down. She stood at the window until the light failed, and the cattle were only a darker darkness in the meadow, and she made herself a promise colder and harder than the one she had made the door. She would not fight him on his ground, in his way, with cattle and confrontation and a strength she did not have. She would beat him with the one thing he could not graze over, or buy off, or send a boy up a mountain to deliver, which was the truth of a bloodline, proved and sealed. Stood up in a courtroom where his 11 summers would count for no more than last year's weather. But to do it, she had to find a living Vane, and the finding of one slid further out of her reach. With every day the thaw opened the roads, and let Thorne's lawyer move faster than a girl on foot ever could. The break, when it came the way these things come, sideways and from a direction she had not been watching. Newt Farrow made good on his spring word, and hauled a load of milled boards up to the fork in April, and he brought with him more than lumber. He brought a man of 29 named Gideon Ross, a joiner by trade with a left hand, gone stiff and scarred from an old accident with a saw, who had come up looking for a season's work and heard in town about the girl holding the ridge. Gideon Ross stayed 2 days and helped her hang a proper plank door. On iron hinges he forged himself in a fire built up against the woodshed, working the metal one-handed with a skill that would have shamed men who had two, and he would take no pay but a jar of the good lard and 24 of the eggs a hen he had carried up in a crate had begun to lay for her. It was Gideon, sitting at her plank table the second evening, with the new door hung and swinging true, who set down his cup and told her, almost idly, that he knew of an old woman down in the rail country south of the divide, a woman his own mother had done sewing for, who carried the name Vane in her people, and had come up out of Kentucky as a girl. Sabra went very still at the table, the way she had gone still at the seep the day Bello came up through the timber. She asked the woman's name, keeping her voice level so as not to spook the thing back into the dark. Coss, Gideon said. Parmelia Coss. Vain before she married, if he had the right of it, and old now, past 70, but sharp as a tack the last he'd heard, living with a grandson's family on a farm 2 days south by rail and wagon. He did not know why the girl's face had changed. He knew only that whatever he had said had landed on her like a struck match, and Sabra, looking at him across the table in the firelight, understood that a stiff-handed joiner, who had climbed a mountain to hang a door, for the price of a jar of lard, had just set the far end of her bridge into her hands. She wrote that same night 2 letters by candle in her own upright hand, one to Elias Poole and one to the name Gideon had given her, and she sent them down with him in the morning to go out on the next post from Fort Draymond, and then she did the hardest thing of all, which was to wait and to trust that a paper carrying her hope would find an old woman 2 days south before Thorne's paper carrying his greed found a magistrate. She had spent her whole life being told patience was a virtue for people of her station. She understood now that patience was no virtue at all but a weapon, the one weapon a person with no money and no standing is ever handed, and that the whole trick of it is to hold steady while the waiting does its level best to break you. The answer from Parmelia Coss came 3 weeks on, carried up by Newt Farrow, along with a crate of Sabra's ordered pane glass packed in straw, and Sabra read it standing in the fold with the freighter waiting, and the mules stamping, and she had to read it twice, because the first time her eyes would not hold the words steady on the page. The old woman remembered. She remembered being a small girl taken to a rail platform in the low country to meet an aunt come down off a mountain, an aunt named Orinda, who had lost her husband to a fall and made the hard choice to send her 2 boys down ahead of her to be raised safe among cousins, and who had lived 4 more years in a sister's house by a south-facing window before she was laid to rest under a chestnut tree with a plain stone. Parmelia Coss remembered those 2 boys grown to men, remembered the weddings and the christenings, remembered the whole shape of the Vane family that had come up out of Kentucky and scattered itself across 2 territories. And she wrote, in a hand that shook but did not once falter, that she would come. She was 72 and the rail and the wagon would use her hard, but she would come to Fort Draymond and stand before any magistrate in the land and swear to the blood. Because a family that lets its own be robbed of what was left them in love is no family at all, only a scatter of people who happen to share a name. Sabra folded the letter against her breast and stood in the wet spring wind with the mules, stamping, and Newt Farrow watching her, with something gentle working in his cured hide face. And she did not weep, though it came closer than it had come since the pantry. She had a witness. The far end of the bridge had a living soul standing on it at last, an old woman who had seen Orinda Ashby with her own child's eyes and could carry that seeing into a courtroom. Whatever Silas Thorne stood up with, whatever his lawyer built out of 11 summers of free grass, it would break against the plain sworn word of a woman of the blood, because the very law Thorne had chosen to make his fight on was the law that would now turn in his hand and cut him, and he had chosen it himself, out of the sure and arrogant belief that Sabra could never find what she had just found. Word of the hearing was set for the last week of May, and word of it moved down the mountain and through the low country the way word moves in a thin peopled land. From wagon seat to store counter to supper table, until the whole settlement knew that the girl who had been snowed off Bracken Ridge in December had a patent and a witness both and meant to stand up in the land office and take back a valley from Silas Thorne. Sabra came down 3 days early and took her old 15-cent room above the feed store, and Verna Tibbet, who had asked her nothing at all in December, now asked her only whether she had eaten, and set a bowl in front of her and told her that half the women in Fort Draymond who had ever been turned off a place or paid short or sent down a road they had not chosen would be sitting in that office come the hearing, not because they knew Sabra, but because they knew to the bone exactly what she was standing up for. There are fights, Verna said, setting the bowl down between her two hands, that a whole town has been waiting years for somebody with nothing left to lose to finally have on its behalf. Parmelia Koss arrived on the morning of the hearing, come up the last stretch by wagon from the railhead, a small, straight-backed old woman in good black wool, with a face like a walnut and eyes that missed nothing that moved. Sabra met her at the wagon and took her hand to help her down, and the old woman looked at her a long moment, at the plain calico and the borrowed coat gone shabby, through a hard winter, and the tin locket at her throat. And she reached up without a word and turned the locket in her fingers, and read the scratched letter on the back of it, and something moved across her old face that was half grief and half a fierce and settling satisfaction. She had never known Docia herself. She told the girl the family had scattered too wide and too early for that. But she had heard tell of her all her life, a Vane woman gone west alone to keep a crossroads stall. Stubborn as a fence post and twice as hard to move. And here at the end of it was that same woman's locket resting at the throat of a girl Orinda's own mountain had reached out and saved. Blood finds its way home, Parmelia Koss said, letting the locket fall back gently against Sabra's collar, even when it must take 30 years and 2 graves to make the journey. The land office was crowded past its walls that morning. Elias Poole had set out what chairs the room held, and men stood 3 deep along the back, and women filled the doorway and spilled onto the step beyond it. And the magistrate had come up from the county seat, a heavy-set, unhurried man named Judge Harmon, who set his hat on the counter and his spectacles on his nose, and made it plain at once that he would have order, and would have the whole of the matter laid before him, and would not be hurried through any part of it by any man standing in the county. Silas Thorne came in with his lawyer, a smooth town man in a good coat, and Thorne took a chair in the front row as if the room were his own parlor. And he did not once look at Sabra as he passed her, which told her more than any glare could have. A man who will not look at the person he has wronged is a man who knows the wrong clean through and fears it, and is counting on the law to keep him from ever having to answer for it to her face. The lawyer spoke first and spoke well, and it was worse than Sabra had feared, because the man did not bluster or bully. He laid it all out cool and reasonable, that Mr. Thorne had grazed the high valley openly and peaceably across 11 summers, that he had improved the range and cleared it of predators and paid, in the sweat of his own hands and his herds, a kind of tax upon that ground no absent paperholder had ever paid, and that the law took proper notice of such long and open use. He allowed that a patent existed somewhere in the ledger. He questioned, in the mildest voice in the world, whether the young woman before them had any true right to step into the shoes of a woman 3 full decades dead, whether a tin locket and a claimed resemblance of surnames was the sort of proof upon which a court would strip a standing citizen of 11 years' honest use. And he suggested, so gently it took Sabra a moment to feel the edge of the knife slide in, that the whole affair had about it the plain look of a scheme. A girl turned off a place for cause who had gone up a mountain, found some old papers under a floor, and dressed herself up in a dead woman's name to seize a valley she had never had any part in. The magistrate listened without expression, made a note, and asked Sabra what she said to it. She stood up. Her legs were not entirely steady under her, but her voice was, because she had spent a whole winter learning to hold the one steady, while the other shook. She did not argue the law, because the law was not hers to argue, and she knew it. She told them instead what had been done to her, plainly, in order, with no heat in it and no plea. She told them she had been turned off Silas Thorne's place in December and paid short of what she had saved with her own two hands. She told them she had been put on a horse under the story of a place waiting at Sable Creek and taken north and west of Sable Creek, up onto the bare shoulder of Bracken Ridge, and set down in the snow above a drop with a bundle at her feet, and told there was a wagon road 3 days off, and left there in the second week of December by two of Mr. Thorne's own hands. She did not raise her voice once. She watched it land in the room instead. Watched the women in the doorway go still as stone. Watched Judge Harmon's pen stop dead over his paper. And she understood in that moment that the plain telling of a true and terrible thing, offered up without a single tear, carries a weight that no lawyer's smoothness on this earth can lift back off it. The lawyer rose to say the court was not gathered to try the manner of her leaving Mr. Thorne's employ, but only the question of the land. And Judge Harmon put up one heavy hand, without so much as looking at him, and told him that when a man's own hands had carried a girl up a mountain in December and set her down above a drop, this court would by God hear about the mountain first and the land after. And the lawyer sat back down. It was then that the door at the back of the crowded room opened, and Rusk Denny came in. He had aged in the months since the ridge, or something in him had aged, the loose, easy foolishness gone off his young face, and a look left in its place of a man who had not been sleeping well or long. He had come. He told the room before anyone thought to ask him a thing, twisting his hat around and around in his hands, because he could not carry it any farther by himself. He had helped take the girl up the ridge in December. He had watched Cade Bellow set her down in the snow, and he had ridden away, and he had told himself every day, since that she must surely have walked out of it. And he had known every day since that this was only a lie a man tells himself so he can keep down his supper. He looked at Sabra then for the first time across the whole crowded room, and what stood in his face was not the small useless thing she had seen when he glanced back at her on the ridge. It was the thing that comes after, when a coward has decided, too late but somehow not entirely too late, to stop being one. A man can ride away from a thing, Rusk Denny said, his voice breaking clean across the middle of it, and still never put one honest mile between himself and it as long as he lives. The room did not stay quiet after that, and Judge Harmon let the noise of it run a moment before he stilled it with a look, and Silas Thorne's smooth lawyer had gone a shade grayer about the mouth, because the whole matter had slipped its neat banks and was running loose now. It was no longer a tidy question of use and paper. There was a girl who had told a plain, true tale of being carried up a mountain to die. And now one of the two men who had done the carrying stood in the room and swore under the weight of his own conscience that every word of it was true, and the whole careful edifice of 11 honest summers had a thing buried under its floorboards that would not stay decently down. Thorne turned in his chair and looked at Rusk Denny with an expression that promised the boy he would never draw another day's wage anywhere in that country. And Rusk Denny looked back at him and did not drop his eyes. And Sabra understood that the boy had just thrown away every practical thing he owned in the world to keep hold of the one thing he had very nearly lost for good, and that it had cost him more to walk through that door than it had cost her to walk half a mile off the ridge, because she had at least been walking towards something, and he had come here to walk away from everything he had. Then Parmelia Cost stood, refusing the arm Elias Poole put out to her, and planted her cane on the plank floor and told the court who she was, and who her people were. And she laid out the vein line the way an old woman lays out across a bed, a quilt she has known her whole life. This square joined here to that one. This marriage sewn to that birth, from Kentucky down to the low country, and up to a mountain, a valley 30 years gone, until the blood ran unbroken in that room from Orinda Vane Ashby, who had filed and proved the claim with her own husband, down through the sister who had raised her two boys, to men, to the very cousins, whose children's children Parmelia could name aloud where they sat. And she told them of the crossroads, Vane, the woman Docia, gone west, with the same stubborn Kentucky bone set in her, who had taken in a scattered, hired man's daughter across 3 winters for no reason under heaven but that the girl had needed the taking in, and had taught her the whole hard art of coming through a killing country alive, and had left her at the last a plain tin locket with a single letter scratched into the back. It was not a legal proof, that last part, and Parmelia knew it and said so plainly. But it was a true thing, she said, and the court had asked to hear the truth. And the whole truth of it was that 2 women of one blood, who had never once in their lives met, had between them raised and saved, and provided for a girl neither of them lived to see grown. And if that was a scheme, then she had never in all her 72 years heard tell of a scheme that took 2 full generations to spring, and asked back nothing at all for itself. Judge Harmon was quiet a long while after she had finished. He looked at the patent Elias Poole had laid open before him, at the seal gone brown with 30 years, at the ledger open to the page where the claim stood clean and unstruck. He looked at Sabra and at the old woman leaning hard on her cane, and at the boy still standing white-faced by the door he had come through. Then he took up his pen and ruled, plainly, in the flat, unhurried voice of a man who has weighed a thing in both hands and found it not near as close as one party had hoped. The patent stood. It had stood 30 years, and no use, however long, or however open, could be permitted to stand against a proved and filed and sealed homestead, because if it could, then no filing anywhere in the territory was worth the paper it was written on, and the whole order of the country would come apart at the seam. The claim of use was denied outright. The trespass notice was void, the trespasser being in plain fact the holder's own proven heir, and Silas Thorne had been grazing, these 11 summers running, not free open range but another family's patented ground, for which the court found he owed a fair rent. Reckoned back across the years his use could be shown. A sum Judge Harmon named aloud, and that made the smooth lawyer flinch, and Thorne go rigid in his chair, because it was not a ruinous sum, but it was a public one, a debt entered into a ledger for the whole country to read at its leisure, the exact and measured price of 11 summers of taking what had never once been his. There was more, and Judge Harmon delivered it without raising his voice at all, because the worst things a man ever hears are most often the ones said quietly. The matter of a girl carried up a mountain in December and set down in the snow to die was not a matter a land office could settle, he said, but it was a matter, and he would see to it himself that it went before the men whose matter it rightly was. Cade Bellow would answer for it in a court fit to hear it, and Silas Thorne, whatever a further court might in time find or fail to find about what he had ordered spoken and what his hands had done past his speaking, would carry out of this room and into the rest of his days the plain public knowledge of what had been done in his name and for his profit. And Judge Harmon said he suspected, looking levelly at the man, that in a country this size and this thinly peopled, that knowledge alone would cost him more across the long run of his life than any rent a court could set against him, because a man may buy a great and endless many things in this world, but he can never once buy back the face the country turns to look at him with. Silas Thorne rose and left the office without a single word, his lawyer gathering papers hurriedly behind him, and he did not look at Sabra on his way out any more than he had looked at her coming in. But the manner of the not looking had wholly changed. In December, he had not looked at her because she was beneath his notice, a small problem already solved and forgotten. Now he could not look at her because she had become the one thing a man of his particular kind cannot abide to stand in a room with, which is a person he wronged with both hands and threw away, standing whole and vindicated in the full light of day where the entire country could watch her do it. She watched him go, and she felt no rush of triumph in it, only a great and level quiet settling through her, the quiet of a debt paid in full and a cold door pulled shut at last, because the men who left her on the ridge had believed to a certainty they were setting a girl down to vanish off the face of the earth, and instead, they had pointed her straight at the one unlocked door in all that country, and now the country itself had turned the heavy key behind her and named the valley below the shack hers. Elias Poole wrote the patent out fresh in her name that same afternoon, Sabra Merrow of Bracken Ridge, holder of the claim in the valley below the shack, 160 acres of timber and meadow and running creek, patented and free and clear, and Parmelia Coss made her firm old mark as witness in the place where the boy Rusk Denny had already set his, and Judge Harmon pressed his seal into the warm red wax. And the thing a locket and a letter and a whole winter of labor had all along been building toward was finished in a line of ink and a scratch of the pen. When it was done, the old woman took Sabra's face in both her dry hands and looked at her a long, steady moment, and told her that Orinda would have liked her fine, that Orinda had always said the mountain would send someone up, worth the sending in the end, and that she herself had waited 30 long years to be proved right about it. And here at last, God be thanked, she was. What a person keeps in the end is never the land, Parmelia Coss said, holding the girl's face. The land keeps itself and outlasts every one of us. What a person keeps is the trust somebody set on them before they ever knew their name. And you have kept it, girl, better by half than they had any right in this world to hope. Sabra walked Parmelia out to the wagon that would start her the long way home, and she pressed on the old woman a jar of the good lard and a length of the black wool she had bought with the first of Orinda's coin, and Parmelia took them, because a gift refused is a bridge half burned before it is ever crossed. And she went off down the south road with a promise to write, and a look back over her shoulder that Sabra would carry with her a long time after. Then Sabra turned and found Rusk Denny still standing alone at the edge of the office yard, no one crossing over to speak a word to him, a young man who had just made himself unemployable in the only country he had ever known for the sake of a girl he had helped to wrong. She crossed the yard to him. He could not meet her eyes at first, and when at last he did, there was no asking for anything in them, no angling after thanks or absolution, only the flat, clean exhaustion of a man who has finally set down a weight he had been carrying too far and too long. She did not tell him it was all right, because it was not all right, and they both of them knew it, and a comfortable lie standing between them now would only have dishonored the hard, true thing he had just done. She told him instead that a man who turns around and comes back is worth 10 who never once ride away, and that there was work waiting up on the ridge for anyone not afraid of the doing of it, and honest wages when the place began at last to pay, and that the offer would keep whether he came to take it up soon or late. It was not forgiveness, quite, not yet. It was something better and a good deal harder, a door left standing open, and Rusk Denny understood the difference. And something eased in his young, ruined face that had not eased in it for months, and he said low that he would think on it. And she found that she believed him. She did not start straight back up the mountain. There was one thing left to do down in the low country, and she did it before her nerve could cool, hiring a wagon and a driver with the last of the coin she had carried down, and riding 2 days east and south to the rail country town Parmelia had named, to the plain small graveyard, where a chestnut tree stood over a stone she had never once laid eyes on. It was in full leaf now, the chestnut, the late spring come further along in the warm, low country than up on her own high ridge, and Sabra stood before the plain gray stone, with Orinda Vane Ashby's name cut deep into it, and the 2 dates that bracketed one hard and generous life between them. And she did not rightly know what she had come all this way to say until she was already saying it. She had come to report. She understood then, the way she had reported all winter long to Docia's empty air with a chisel in her cold hand. The roof was sound, she told the stone. The chinking held against the wind. The claim was proved, and the valley was safe. And the man who had grazed it all those years was answering for the taking of it. And the boys Orinda had sent down out of the high country so long ago had lived, and grown to be men, and left behind them grandchildren who still knew the whole family quilt square by heart. and one of them had climbed a mountain on an old woman's failing legs to stand up and say so out loud. "You did not lose them," she told the woman under the chestnut tree, saying at last the thing she guessed that woman had wanted more than any other, across 30 silent years to be sure of. "You sent them down out of the cold and they lived, and they remembered you, and it came all the way back around at the end to your own front door." She stood there until the light went long and gold through the chestnut leaves above her. And then she went back to the waiting wagon, because the dead do not need us to stay on with them, only to have come the distance. And she had come. The high country had turned entirely by the time she made her way back up to the fold. The meadow greened over to its far edges, and the creek dropped from its roar to a summer murmur. The whole ridge transformed in the space of a few warm weeks from the white country that had tried its level best to end her into a green and breathing one that seemed to have held its breath the whole winter through, only to show her now what it could be. Thorne's cattle were gone out of the valley. She never learned whether he had driven them off ahead of the ruling or after it. And she found she did not care in the least to know, because the meadow was hers now, in ink and in wax, and in the plain sight of the whole country around it. And the grass that came up green through it that summer would fatten no herd but her own, when at last she was ready to keep one. Through that first green summer, the place became, day by unhurried day, the thing Orinda had left it, hoping some stranger would one day make of it. Sabra broke ground in the meadow below the shack with a borrowed single-blade plow and one of Newt Farrow's near mules, and she planted Orinda's corn in 6 long rows down the south fence line, and the turnip and the cabbage and the kale in a squared kitchen plot behind the new woodshed, and the beans up hazel poles she cut and set herself. What came up out of that ground was hers, root and stalk and seed, the first food in her whole life that no one could turn her off of, or dock from her wages, or count back out of a tobacco tin behind a flour bin. She bought a milk goat from a family down at the crossing for $4 and led her up the ridge on a rope. And the goat came up the mountain behind her, without once balking. And Sabra named her Nan for no better reason than that the name seemed to suit her. And Nan's milk and the good yellow soap Sabra rendered from the lard and the wood ash of her own stove began, by the tail of that summer, to move down the wagon road to Fort Draymond under a paper card at Otho Sedge's counter that read only, in Sabra's upright hand, Bracken Ridge. Rusk Denny came up to the ridge in July, on foot, with a bedroll and a borrowed axe, and the look of a man who had thought about a thing a long time before he did it. And Sabra put him to the work she had promised him, and he did it well, and did not shirk it, and did not once speak of the ridge or the winter. And slowly, across that summer and the ones that came after, the open door she had left him became a thing closer to trust, which is a house that gets built the same patient way a wall gets chinked, one small honest seam at a time. Gideon Ross came up again with the pane glass in a padded crate and set it into the north window frame with his one good hand. So the oiled paper came down at last, and the true light came in. Verna Tibbet sent up a rag rug she had made from Sabra's worn-out calico. Newt Farrow hauled his loads to the fork in April and June and September and would still, some trips, not take the whole of his $1.50. The line shack had become a house, and the claim had become a homestead, and the girl who had been set down in the snow above the ridge to disappear had become, in the plain, unhurried accounting of the people at Fort Draymond, a woman with a place of her own and a name they said with respect. On a clear, cold evening, in the third winter after she had been set down on the ridge, Sabra sat at the plank table beneath the north window in a dress of good black wool she had sewn herself across 4 evenings, a mug of coffee cooling at her elbow, and a leather-bound ledger open in front of her that Gideon Ross had made and given her, and she did not write in it for a long while. The stove was drawing clean and even. Nan was shut into her pole barn for the night with a manger of hay. The true glass window gave back the small warm room to her in the lamplight. And beyond it, the snow was coming down straight and quiet, and the lamplight fell in a soft yellow square across the pine boards of the floor, and reached almost to the seam, where, 3 winters gone, she had lifted 3 shortcut boards with the pole of a chipped axe. She looked at that seam a while. She had never once nailed it shut again. She had cleaned its edges and sanded them smooth with a scrap of stone and waxed them with tallow, and fitted the boards back so they lay flush and could be lifted out again with a fingernail by anyone who thought to try. Below them, the 5 earthen steps still went down to the old plank door with its patient hinges. And behind the door the small cellar held now, what she kept there, a shelf of jars of good rendered lard. Braided onions hung from a peg, salted cabbage down in a Fort Draymond crock, the tea box with the last of Arinda's coins still in it. And on the top plank of the shelf where the letter had waited 30 years for her, a folded square of oilskin holding nothing more than a scrap of scrap paper on which Sabra had written, in her own upright hand, "Be steady," in case whoever came next down out of the cold should one day have need to read it. She touched the tin locket at her throat, the plain one on its braided horsehair cord, with the single letter scratched into the back. And she thought, the way she often did on the quiet evenings, of the 2 women who had loved her without ever once being asked to. Docia Vane, who had raised her across 3 hard winters and left her a locket and 2 words to live the rest of her life by. And Arinda Vane Ashby, who had never known her name nor her face, and had left her a house and a claim and a letter that began, "To whoever finds this, go gently." 2 strangers out of 2 vanished lives, both of them wanting nothing in the end, but that a girl they would never live to see grown might have a patch of solid ground to stand on and call her own. Somewhere down in the low country, Silas Thorne was living out the smaller life the county had left him after it learned what it learned. And Sabra found, when she thought of him at all now, that she thought of him without any heat, the way a person thinks of weather that crossed the ridge long ago and can never come back over it. They had believed they were setting a girl down to be forgotten by the world. What they had done instead, without ever once meaning to, was hand her the one true inheritance no man alive could sign away or graze over or dock from her pay, which is not gold and is not even land, but the plain unkillable, knowing in a pair of hands that has been taught, patiently, by someone who loved the teaching more than they would ever live to see the fruit of it. She banked the stove for the night the way Docia had taught her, so the kitchen would still hold its warmth come noon. And she blew out the lamp, and she lay down on the plank bunk under the gray wool blanket with the black dress hung on its peg, and she listened to the snow come down soft and steady on the cedar shakes she had split, and laid herself with her own 2 hands. She had been 22 and left for dead on the winter trail above Bracken Ridge, with $4.80 pinned inside her petticoat, a borrowed coat on her back, and a tin locket at her throat. And she had walked half a mile off that ridge to a shack no one on earth wanted, and lifted 3 short boards off a cold pine floor. It was the best half mile she ever walked in all her life. If this story has settled into you, the way these stories are meant to settle, quiet, and staying with you a while after the fire has burned down, then take a moment before you go and tell me, down in the comments, the name of the one person in your own life, living, still, or long gone on ahead of you, who taught you the small, steady skills that would one day carry you whole through a hard winter they themselves never lived to see. Say the name once, the way Sabra learned at last to say Docias and Arindas. Tell me where you're watching from tonight, and I will see you again by the next fire.